The winter wind cut across the Idaho prairie like a blade, and Daniel Reeves could feel it through every gap in his barn's siding as he worked to free the frozen waterline that had stopped flowing sometime during the night. He'd been up since 4 a.m., which wasn't unusual for someone running a cattle operation in the high desert country north of Twin Falls. But the cold had been brutal this January, dropping to 20 below for 3 straight nights and wreaking havoc on infrastructure that was already old when Daniel's grandfather had bought this property in 1962. The barn was a massive pole structure built in the 70s, 60 feet by 80, with a loft that ran the full length and enough space below to house equipment, hay storage, and the workshop where Daniel spent his winters repairing everything that broke during the rest of the year. Beside him, working her own investigation of the frozen pipe situation, Sasha moved with the careful precision that had made her an exceptional military working dog during their 4 years together in the Marine Corps. The Belgian Malinois was 9 years old now, showing some grey in her muzzle, but still carrying herself with the alert intensity that had saved Daniel's life twice in Afghanistan and earned her a chest full of commendations that sat in a box in his house because dogs didn't wear medals. She sniffed along the pipe's path, tracking the scent of water or lack thereof, and paused at a junction point near the barn's northeast corner. Daniel followed her focus and crouched beside the joint. Ice had expanded inside the galvanized pipe, splitting the metal along a seam he should have reinforced last fall, but had put off because there was always something more urgent demanding attention. Now he'd pay for that procrastination with a morning of repair work in temperatures that made his old shoulder injury ache like the shrapnel was still lodged there. Good girl, Sasha. Found the problem. She wagged her tail once, an economical gesture of acknowledgement, then returned to patrol mode, checking the rest of the barn while Daniel gathered tools from his workbench. The barn was divided into sections by partial walls and equipment placement, creating zones for different functions. The main floor held his tractors and implements. The hay was stacked along the south wall under tarps, and the workshop occupied the northwest quarter, its concrete floor marked with decades of oil stains and dropped bolts. Above everything, the loft stretched out in shadows, illuminated only by the few bare bulbs Daniel had strung up there for the rare occasions when he needed to access stored items. He'd been meaning to clean out that loft for the 2 years since he'd bought the property from his uncle's estate, but the accumulated possessions of 3 generations of Reeves family ranching created a sorting project that kept getting deferred. Boxes of records, old furniture, equipment that hadn't been used since the 60s, even a vintage tractor his grandfather had apparently been too sentimental to scrap. It all waited up there in the cold and dust, silent witnesses to the family history Daniel had inherited, along with the land. The pipe repair took 90 minutes, long enough for the sun to clear the eastern horizon and paint the snow-covered fields in shades of gold and blue. Daniel restored water flow, checked for additional leaks, and was cleaning his tools when Sasha's bark brought him fully alert. Not her stranger alert, not her game alert, but something else. A sound Daniel had heard only a handful of times, always when she detected something her training didn't provide a framework for processing. He found her at the base of the loft ladder, staring upward with her ears pinned forward and her tail rigid. The stance was pure focus, but the whine building in her throat carried confusion. "What have you got, girl?" She glanced at him, then back up at the loft, and barked again. Whatever had triggered her attention was up there, and her assessment said it required his investigation. Daniel trusted that assessment more than he trusted most human intelligence. Sasha had been right about threats and anomalies more times than he could count, and her instincts had been honed through breeding and training and combat experience into something approaching supernatural sensitivity. He climbed the ladder with Sasha following, her claws clicking on the wooden rungs, and emerged into the loft's gloom. The space smelled of old hay and mouse droppings and the particular staleness of air that hadn't circulated properly in years. Daniel pulled out his flashlight and swept the beam across stacked boxes and furniture draped in dusty sheets. Everything looked exactly as it had the last time he'd been up here, which was months ago when he'd retrieved some old fence wire. But Sasha moved immediately toward the northeast corner, the area above where he'd just repaired the pipe, and her intensity suggested she'd found something significant. Daniel followed, picking his way through obstacles, and stopped when his flashlight beam caught something that shouldn't have been there. The wall showed a gap, a vertical seam perhaps 3 feet wide, running from floor to rafters, and through that gap spilled light. Not the grey morning light filtering through the barn's windows, but a warmer illumination that looked artificial and somehow wrong for this space. Daniel approached slowly, every sense on alert, and saw that the gap wasn't in the barn's outer wall, but in something else, a barrier or partition that existed between the barn's structural elements. He reached the opening and looked through. What he saw made no sense. The space beyond the gap appeared to be another barn loft, structurally identical to the one he stood in, with the same layout of boxes and furniture and even the same dust patterns. But the light was different, brighter somehow, and the air that drifted through the gap carried warmth despite the freezing temperatures outside. Daniel played his flashlight through the opening, illuminating what looked like a perfect mirror of his own loft, and then the beam caught movement. Someone was there. A man, standing perhaps 20 feet away, holding his own flashlight and looking back at Daniel with an expression that probably matched Daniel's own confusion and shock. The man wore canvas work pants and a fleece jacket, the same outfit Daniel had pulled on this morning. He had the same build, the same posture, even the same beard Daniel had been growing since November because winter in Idaho didn't require the grooming standards the Marine Corps had demanded. The man was Daniel, or a version of Daniel so identical that distinguishing them would require examination beyond what flashlight beams across 20 feet could provide. And beside the other, Daniel stood another Sasha, same coloring, same alert stance, same focus on the gap that divided them. Daniel's first coherent thought was that he was looking at a mirror, some elaborate trick of reflection that created the illusion of depth and duplication. But mirrors didn't show independent movement, and the other Daniel was shifting his weight in ways that didn't match Daniel's own stance. Mirrors didn't let warm air pass through, and Daniel could feel the temperature differential flowing from the gap like breath from an open door. His second thought was that someone had built a hidden room in his barn, installed it without his knowledge, and was now living there in secret while dressed and groomed to impersonate him. But that made even less sense than the mirror theory, required levels of dedication and access that seemed impossible, and didn't explain how the hidden room could contain identical copies of boxes and furniture that Daniel knew to be unique. The other Daniel raised his hand slowly, a gesture that might have been greeting or question or simple acknowledgement of the impossible situation. Daniel found his own hand rising in unconscious mirror, and the synchronization broke through his analytical paralysis. This wasn't reflection, wasn't impersonation, wasn't anything his mind could categorize using frameworks built from normal experience. "Who are you?" Daniel's voice came out rough, strained by cold and shock. The other Daniel's lips moved, but no sound penetrated the gap. Whatever barrier divided them blocked acoustic transmission while allowing light and air to pass. Daniel tried again, louder, but got the same result. The other Daniel shook his head, pointed to his ears, and shrugged. The universal gesture for "I can't hear you." Sasha had been standing rigid beside Daniel, but now she moved toward the gap, drawn by the presence of the other dog, or by curiosity or by instincts Daniel couldn't interpret. The other Sasha moved too, approaching from her side, and the two dogs met at the barrier, sniffing at the air where the two spaces intersected. Neither showed aggression, just intense interest, mixed with the same confusion Daniel felt radiating from his own chest. Daniel pulled out his phone and tried to take a photo of what he was seeing, but the camera struggled with the lighting differential and produced only a blurred image that showed the gap and some indistinct shapes beyond. He tried video with similar results. Whatever this was, it resisted easy documentation, which meant he'd have no proof beyond his own testimony and Sasha's behavior, neither of which would convince anyone who hadn't witnessed this directly. The other Daniel was trying something too, gesturing toward the gap and then to himself, asking a question Daniel could interpret even without sound. Should they try to cross through? Daniel's instinct said absolutely not, that crossing through an impossible barrier into a space that shouldn't exist was exactly the kind of decision that got people killed or lost in ways that transcended normal definitions of those terms. But another part of him, the part that had spent years walking into uncertain situations because the mission required it, wanted to know what would happen, needed to understand what he was dealing with. He held up a hand, signaling wait, and looked around for something he could use to test the barrier. A piece of hay bale string sat nearby, and he picked it up, tied a small nut from his pocket to one end for weight, and tossed it through the gap. The string sailed across the boundary without resistance, and the other Daniel caught it, examined it, then tossed it back. The nut returned to Daniel's side of the gap, and he caught it, noting it felt normal, unchanged by passage through whatever divided the two spaces. So objects could cross freely, at least small ones. That suggested the barrier wasn't solid, or wasn't uniformly present, that it existed more as a threshold than a wall. Daniel pulled out his work glove and tossed it through. The other Daniel caught it, looked at it closely, and held it up for Daniel to see. The glove appeared unchanged, no damage or alteration, and when the other Daniel threw it back, it returned in the same condition. The dogs had lost interest in the standoff and were now playing, or attempting to play, across the barrier. They'd found that they could push their paws into the gap, and they were now engaged in a strange game of touch that required them to reach through the boundary to make contact. Neither showed distress, just the focused enjoyment that came from novel interaction. Daniel made a decision that felt both inevitable and possibly catastrophic. He'd test the crossing himself, put one hand through to see what happened to living tissue when it penetrated whatever forces maintained this impossible threshold. He moved to the gap, extended his right hand slowly, and pushed it through into the space beyond. Cold hit him immediately, not the winter cold of Idaho, but something deeper, more fundamental, as though his hand had been plunged into a medium that existed at temperatures approaching absolute zero. The cold shot up his arm and into his chest, stealing his breath, and for a moment Daniel thought he'd made a terrible mistake, that his hand would freeze solid and snap off at the wrist. But then the cold stabilized, became painful but bearable, and he found he could move his fingers, could feel the warmer air on the other side of the gap, even as the barrier's transition zone burned with cold. The other Daniel was staring at his hand, which Daniel realized had emerged on that side of the barrier, visible and apparently solid, despite the impossibility of the situation. Slowly, cautiously, the other Daniel reached out and touched Daniel's extended hand. The contact was strange, like touching himself through a layer of electricity, sensation translated through interference that made everything feel slightly wrong. But it was real contact. Warm skin meeting warm skin across a boundary that shouldn't exist. They held that contact for 5 seconds, two versions of the same man acknowledging each other through touch, and then Daniel pulled his hand back through the gap. The cold burned again during withdrawal, and when his hand cleared the boundary, it was marked with frost, ice crystals forming on his skin where it had passed through the transition. He flexed his fingers, restoring circulation, and watched the frost melt, leaving his hand red and tender, but functional. The other Daniel had backed away from the gap, and he was making gestures that Daniel interpreted as concern or warning. Don't try to cross, or maybe that was dangerous, or simply be careful. Daniel nodded acknowledgement, his mind already working through the implications of what he'd just experienced. The barrier had physical properties, could affect matter passing through it, but wasn't impassable. That suggested it was a threshold, a boundary between spaces that could be crossed but only at cost. And what were these spaces? The most obvious interpretation, the one that made sense, even though it required accepting premises that violated everything Daniel understood about physics and reality, was that he was looking at a parallel dimension, an alternate version of his barn, existing in the same location, but separated by some quantum boundary that normally kept such spaces isolated. The other Daniel was himself in that other dimension, living a life that had presumably been identical or nearly so up until this moment when both of them had discovered this gap in the boundaries between worlds. But when had the gap appeared? Daniel's barn had been standing since the 70s, and if this portal or threshold or whatever it was had existed all that time, surely someone would have noticed, unless it was new, created by some event or condition that had only recently aligned. Or unless it had always been there but hidden, sealed behind the wall's normal configuration until something changed and revealed it. Daniel looked at the northeast corner where he'd just repaired the frozen pipe. The corner was directly below this spot, and the pipe break had been caused by ice expansion, pressure building, until the metal split. What if that same pressure, or the vibration from his repair work, or some combination of factors, had disturbed whatever kept this portal concealed? What if fixing the pipe had inadvertently opened a door he'd been living above for 2 years without knowing it existed? He moved back to the gap and tried to signal these questions to the other Daniel, but the communication limitations made complex ideas impossible to convey. The other Daniel seemed to be trying to tell him something too, gesturing at the gap, and then at the loft floor, at the watch on his wrist, at the sky visible through distant windows. Daniel couldn't pass the meaning, couldn't translate gesture into coherent message, and frustration built in his chest. They needed to find a way to communicate properly, needed to establish what was happening and what should be done about it. Daniel held up one finger, signaling wait, and descended the ladder quickly. Sasha followed, reluctant to leave the other dog, and Daniel rummaged through his workshop until he found a notebook and marker. He climbed back up, moved to the gap, and wrote in large letters, "Can you read this?" The other Daniel nodded vigorously and disappeared from view, returning a moment later with his own notebook and marker. He wrote, "Yes, what is happening?" Daniel wrote, "Portal, parallel dimension. You are me in another world." The other Daniel stared at those words for a long moment, then wrote, "That is insane." Daniel wrote, "I know, but what else explains it?" The other Daniel wrote, "Nothing. This started when?" Daniel wrote, "Today. Fixed pipe below. Found this after. You?" The other Daniel wrote, "Same. Pipe broke last night. Fixed it this morning. Found portal after dog alerted." So the timeline matched, the sequence of events identical on both sides up to the point of discovery. That supported the parallel dimension theory, suggested these two realities had been running in sync until the portal opened and made them aware of each other. Daniel wrote, "What do we do?" The other Daniel wrote, "Not sure. Document it? Call someone?" Daniel wrote, "Who? Police, university, military?" The other Daniel wrote, "Military has resources, might have protocols." Daniel considered. He'd been out of the Marines for 6 years, living civilian life, and the thought of bringing his situation to official attention made his stomach tighten. He'd seen how the military handled things that didn't fit normal parameters, how quickly classification and containment became priorities over individual welfare. And if this portal was what it appeared to be, if it genuinely connected parallel dimensions, the security implications were enormous. He'd be debriefed, studied, probably restricted in ways that would make his current life impossible. But the alternative was dealing with this alone, and Daniel knew his limits. He understood tactics and logistics and how to maintain equipment in hostile environments, but he didn't understand quantum physics or dimensional theory or whatever field of science applied to portals between worlds. He needed expertise he didn't possess, and that meant involving others, whether he liked it or not. He wrote, "Agreed, but carefully. Need to control narrative." The other, Daniel, wrote, "I know someone. Physicist at Idaho State. Grad school friend. Trustworthy." Daniel wrote, "Same person exists in your dimension and mine?" The other, Daniel, wrote, "Probably. Want me to contact her?" Daniel thought about that. If the same person existed in both dimensions with similar backgrounds, she might be uniquely positioned to understand this situation without immediately escalating to authorities. And having expert assessment before making any official reports would give them better information for deciding next steps. He wrote, "Yes, tell her minimum necessary. Get her here soon." The other, Daniel, wrote, "We'll call now. Back in 1 hour." He disappeared down his ladder, and Daniel was left alone in the loft with Sasha and the impossible portal that had just turned his quiet ranching life into something that belonged in theoretical physics journals. He sat down on a hay bale and tried to process what had happened, tried to fit this discovery into a worldview that had been built on direct experience and practical knowledge. The attempt failed. This was too far outside his framework, too fundamentally strange to be accommodated by adjustment or rationalization. Sasha climbed onto the hay bale beside him and pressed against his side, offering the steady presence that had gotten him through other moments when the world exceeded his capacity to understand it. He wrapped an arm around her and held on, needing the reminder that some things remained constant even when reality revealed itself to be far more complex and bizarre than any previous experience suggested. The hour passed slowly. Daniel stayed in the loft, monitoring the portal for any changes in its appearance or behavior. The gap remained stable, the light and temperature constant, no indication that it might suddenly close or expand or do anything other than persist as a window between worlds. He tested it periodically with small objects, always with the same result. Items crossed easily, returned unchanged, and the barrier's cold affected only the transition zone itself. He also explored the loft more thoroughly, looking for any other anomalies or signs that the portal might be part of a larger phenomenon. He found nothing unusual beyond the gap itself, no other openings or distortions, no equipment that might be generating or controlling the portal. It simply existed, as far as he could determine, a natural or spontaneous occurrence that defied explanation but demanded accommodation. Movement through the gap caught his attention, and he looked up to see the other Daniel returning, accompanied by a woman, perhaps in her late 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and the kind of practical clothing that suggested someone who didn't bother much with appearance. She stopped when she saw the gap, her expression shifting from skepticism to wonder, and moved closer with cautious steps. The other Daniel handed her a notebook, and she wrote, "Dr. Elena Martinez. Particle physics, this is real." Daniel wrote back, "As real as anything I've experienced." She wrote, "I need to run tests, establish what we're dealing with." Daniel wrote, "Go ahead. I'm Daniel Reeves, Staff Sergeant Marines retired." She wrote, "Thank you for your service and for not panicking about this." Daniel wrote, "Panicking comes later. Right now, I need information." Eleanor smiled at that and started unpacking equipment from a bag the other Daniel had carried up. She had instruments that looked scientific and expensive, devices that measured electromagnetic fields and radiation and other things Daniel couldn't identify. She worked methodically, taking readings from multiple positions around the gap, occasionally writing observations in her own notebook, never showing the excitement or alarm Daniel thought the situation warranted. Professional detachment, he recognized it from his own military experience, the ability to stay focused on process even when confronting something extraordinary. After 30 minutes, she wrote, "Portal shows quantum entanglement signatures, stable wormhole connecting two parallel space-time regions. Shouldn't be possible, but measurements don't lie. Daniel wrote, "Can you control it?" She wrote, "Not yet, but I'm seeing patterns. Portal anchored to physical structure. Barn's geometry matters." Daniel wrote, "What about crossing through?" She wrote, "Dangerous. Transition zone shows extreme energy fluctuation. Could damage biological tissue." Daniel held up his hand, showing the redness where he'd pushed through earlier. Elena's eyes widened and she wrote, "You already tried?" Daniel wrote, "Had to know if it was possible." She wrote, "Reckless but useful data. Shows crossing is survivable short-term. Long-term, unknown." Daniel wrote, "What happens if someone crosses completely?" She wrote, "Theoretically, they'd exist in the target dimension, but return might be difficult or impossible." That matched Daniel's own assessment of the risk. Crossing through might be one way, and anyone who attempted it would be betting their entire life on being able to return. The stakes were absolute, the consequences of miscalculation irreversible. And yet Daniel found himself wondering what it would be like on the other side, in a dimension that was almost his own, but diverged in ways he couldn't yet identify. Elena wrote, "I need to bring more equipment. Study this properly. Can you keep it quiet for now?" Daniel wrote, "How long?" She wrote, 48 hours. Then we need to make official report." Daniel looked at the other Daniel through the gap, saw his counterpart nod agreement. 2 days to understand this before it became public knowledge and attracted attention neither of them wanted. That seemed reasonable, gave them time to gather information and decide how to present their discovery in ways that might maintain some control over what happened next. He wrote, "Agreed, 48 hours. Elena and the other Daniel left with promises to return the next morning with better equipment and more time to conduct thorough analysis. Daniel remained in the loft, reluctant to leave the portal unguarded, even though he had no idea what guarding it would accomplish. Sasha had settled down for a nap, apparently satisfied that the initial excitement had passed, and normal, boring human activity would dominate the rest of the day. Daniel descended the ladder eventually, needing food and bathroom facilities and time away from the portal's presence. He made lunch without tasting it, his mind still caught on what he'd seen and touched, on the implications of parallel dimensions existing in such close proximity that a simple gap in a barn wall could reveal them. How many other dimensions might exist, separated from his own by barriers so thin that the right circumstances could expose them? How much of what he'd accepted as solid reality was actually porous, permeable, ready to reveal alternatives if he only knew where to look? These questions had no answers he could access, and thinking about them made his head hurt. He finished eating and went back outside to check on his cattle, needing the routine of ranching work to anchor himself in the familiar. The cattle were fine, grazing on the hay he'd put out that morning, their concerns limited to food and shelter and the social dynamics of the herd. Daniel envied them their simple existence, their freedom from questions about dimensional boundaries and parallel selves. He worked through the afternoon, repairing fence and checking water systems and maintaining the infrastructure his cattle depended on. Sasha ranged ahead, doing her own patrol, occasionally looking back to verify his position. The work was cold and hard, and exactly what Daniel needed. A reminder that life continued regardless of cosmic strangeness, that cattle still needed care, and fences still needed mending, and the sun would set the same way it always had. By evening, he'd convinced himself he could handle this situation, could work with Elena and the other Daniel to understand the portal and figure out appropriate next steps. They'd document everything, establish protocols for managing it, maybe even learn something valuable about the nature of reality. It would be complicated and probably stressful, but Daniel had handled complicated and stressful before. This was just another challenge, requiring adaptation and persistence. That conviction lasted until he went back to the barn after dinner and climbed to the loft to check on the portal one more time before bed. The gap was still there, still showing the other loft and the warm light that marked it as different from his own space. But now, there was something else, something he hadn't seen earlier. A figure stood in the other loft, visible through the gap, but definitely not the other Daniel. This person was taller, heavier, wearing different clothes, and they were examining the portal from that side with clear interest. As Daniel watched, frozen at the top of the ladder, the figure noticed him and turned to face him directly. The man was maybe 50 years old, with grey hair and a weathered face that suggested decades of outdoor work. He wore canvas coveralls and boots, practical clothing for ranch work, but his expression carried none of the confusion or wonder Daniel had seen in the other Daniel's face. This man looked calculating, assessing, as though the portal was a resource to be evaluated, rather than a mystery to be understood. The man raised a hand in greeting, and Daniel found himself returning the gesture automatically. Then the man pulled out a notebook and wrote something, holding it up for Daniel to read. "Who are you?" Daniel grabbed his own notebook and wrote, "Daniel Reeves, this is my barn. Who are you?" The man wrote, "Robert Henderson, this was my barn. Sold it 3 years ago." Daniel felt his stomach drop. This wasn't the other Daniel, wasn't a parallel version of himself. This was someone else entirely, someone who existed in that other dimension but had no counterpart in Daniel's life. Which meant the portal didn't just connect two parallel versions of the same world. It connected dimensions that might diverge significantly, might contain people and histories that had no relationship to Daniel's own experience. He wrote, "Where is the other Daniel, the one who looks like me?" Robert wrote, "Don't know. Found this portal hour ago. Been exploring." Daniel wrote, "You shouldn't be here. This is dangerous." Robert wrote, "Dangerous how? Looks stable to me." Daniel wrote, "We don't understand it yet. Need to study it before people start crossing." Robert wrote, "Maybe, or maybe you just want to control access." The words carried implication that made Daniel uneasy. He wrote, "I don't want to control anything. Just want to keep people safe." Robert wrote, "Sure. Well, I'm going to keep looking around. This is public knowledge soon." He turned away from the portal and disappeared into the shadows of the other loft before Daniel could respond. Daniel stood gripping his notebook, mind racing through implications. If Robert had found the portal independently, that meant it was visible from both sides, even when Daniel wasn't present. And if Robert could find it, others could too. The idea that he and Elena had 48 hours to study this quietly before going public was probably naive. They might have hours or less before someone else discovered it and word spread in ways they couldn't control. He descended the ladder and immediately called the number the other Daniel had provided for Elena. She answered after 2 rings, her voice suggesting he'd woken her despite the early hour. "This is Elena. It's Daniel Reeves. We have a problem. Someone else found the portal. An older guy named Robert Henderson. He was exploring the other side, said he plans to keep looking around." Silence on the line. Then Eleanor said, "That's not good. If he spreads word before we can establish proper protocols, this situation could get out of control very fast. What do we do? I'm coming over now, and I'm bringing the equipment I was planning to use tomorrow. We need to document this thoroughly tonight, establish as much baseline data as possible before chaos hits. The other Daniel should probably be here too. I'll call him on my way. See you in 45 minutes. The call ended, and Daniel stood in his barn's cold space, looking up at the loft where the portal waited, and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He'd thought this was a mystery he could help solve, a phenomenon that would reveal its secrets through patient study and careful analysis. Now it looked more like a crisis with expanding dimensions and unpredictable consequences, and Daniel's role was shifting from discoverer to someone trying to maintain control over a situation that was already slipping away. Sasha pressed against his leg, sensing his distress, and Daniel reached down to scratch behind her ears. "We're okay, girl. Just got to adapt to changing conditions. We've done that before." She huffed, her version of agreement or maybe just acknowledgement that he'd spoken. and they climbed back up to the loft together to wait for Elena and whatever came next. Elena arrived 37 minutes later, her van loaded with equipment that looked more extensive than what she'd brought earlier. The other Daniel was with her, and together they hauled cases and instruments up the ladder while Daniel helped position things and Sasha supervised from a hay bale. Within 20 minutes, they had a functional lab set up around the portal, monitors and sensors and devices that hummed with power as they gathered data. Eleanor worked with focused intensity, moving between instruments and typing notes into a laptop, occasionally muttering observations that meant nothing to Daniel but seemed significant to her. The other Daniel helped where he could, holding equipment or reading out values Elena requested, and Daniel mostly stayed out of the way while keeping watch on the portal for any sign of Robert or other unexpected visitors from the other side. Around midnight, Elena called them both over to look at her laptop screen, which showed graphs and data Daniel couldn't interpret. She pointed to a specific section. The portal is generating massive amounts of energy, drawing it from some source I can't identify. And it's not stable. These fluctuations suggest it could collapse or expand without warning. What determines whether it collapses or expands? The other Daniel asked. I don't know yet, but I'm seeing patterns that suggest the barn's structure matters. Something about the geometry, the way the support beams intersect, maybe even the materials used in construction. This building is acting like an antenna or resonator for whatever forces create the portal. Daniel thought about that. My grandfather built this barn in 1974, used specific timber he'd been aging for years. Always said he wanted it to last forever. Eleanor looked at him sharply. What kind of timber? Douglas fir, mostly. Some pine for cross-bracing. Why? Wood has crystalline structure, natural resonance frequencies. If the geometry is right, if the timber is arranged in specific patterns, it could create conditions that allow quantum tunneling between dimensions. She turned back to her laptop. This is incredible. Your barn might be a naturally occurring dimensional gateway, activated by the right environmental conditions. What conditions? The other Daniel asked. Temperature fluctuation is my guess. The pipe burst created pressure waves through the structure, vibrations that reached the loft and disrupted whatever equilibrium kept the portal sealed. When you repaired the pipe, additional vibrations opened it fully. Daniel looked at the portal with new understanding. It wasn't random, wasn't spontaneous appearance from nothing. It had always been there, waiting for the right trigger to reveal itself. And now that it was open, they had no idea how to close it or whether closing it was even possible. What about the people on the other side? Daniel asked. Robert and whoever else might be over there. Are they at risk? Depends. If they stay away from the portal, probably not. But if they try to cross through, or if the portal destabilizes while they're near it, the energy release could be catastrophic. Catastrophic how? Elena hesitated. Think about what happens when you tear a hole in space-time, all that compressed dimension trying to equalize across the boundary. The math suggests it could be equivalent to a small nuclear explosion. The other, Daniel, went pale. We need to warn people. Get them away from the portal on both sides. Agreed, but how? We can't exactly call the authorities and say there's a dimensional portal in a barn that might explode. They'd think we're insane. Daniel pulled out his notebook and moved to the portal. He wrote in the largest letters that would fit, Danger, portal unstable, evacuate area now. He held up the sign, but no one was visible on the other side to read it. He tried waving it around, hoping movement would attract attention. And finally, he saw someone appear in the distance. Not Robert this time, but a younger person, maybe a teenager, who approached the portal with obvious curiosity. Daniel wrote, Get adults. Tell them portal is dangerous, need to evacuate. The teenager read the sign, looked skeptical but nodded and disappeared. Daniel had no idea if the message would be taken seriously, if adults on that side would believe a warning scrawled on cardboard by a stranger from another dimension. but it was the only option he had for communicating the danger Elena's data suggested was real and growing. The night stretched into morning, and still they worked. Elena gathered more measurements while both Daniels took turns monitoring the portal and trying to sleep in the cold loft. Sasha and the other Sasha had discovered each other again and were engaged in a play session that looked strange, given they couldn't fully interact across the dimensional boundary. Dogs apparently didn't care about the physics of their situation, only about the novelty of meeting something familiar but slightly different. Around dawn, Elena made an announcement. The portal is expanding, slowly but measurably. At current rate, it'll be twice its original size within 72 hours. What happens then? Daniel asked. I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe it stabilizes at the new size, or maybe it keeps expanding until it destabilizes and collapses catastrophically. Can we stop it? Not with the equipment I have. We'd need industrial-grade field generators, maybe even particle accelerator components. Resources I don't have access to. The other Daniel said, then we need to make that official report now, before this gets worse. Eleanor nodded. Agreed. I'll contact the university physics department, explain what we've found. They'll escalate to appropriate authorities. Daniel wanted to object, to maintain the control he'd briefly thought possible, but he understood they were past the point where personal preferences mattered. This was bigger than any individual's concerns, required resources and expertise beyond what Elena could provide alone. He said, do it, but document that we tried to handle this responsibly. I don't want to be blamed when this turns into a circus. Eleanor made the call, speaking in technical terms that Daniel mostly didn't understand, but that apparently convinced whoever was on the other end to take the situation seriously. She ended the call and said, they're sending a team. Should be here within 2 hours. Those 2 hours felt like 2 days. Daniel paced the loft, watching the portal for changes, noting that Eleanor was right about the expansion. The gap was visibly wider now, the view into the other dimension clearer. And there was activity on the other side, multiple people moving around with equipment that looked similar to what Elena had brought. Someone over there was taking this seriously too, conducting their own analysis, probably reaching the same conclusions about instability and danger. The university team arrived exactly on schedule, 4 people in a van loaded with equipment that made Elena's setup look amateur. They climbed to the loft, assessed the portal, and immediately began more sophisticated measurements. The team leader, a man perhaps in his 60s who introduced himself as Dr. William Chen, questioned Daniel and Elena extensively about the portal's discovery and behavior. After an hour of this, Dr. Chen made a call on his satellite phone, speaking in careful terms about dimensional anomalies and potential security implications. Daniel heard enough to understand they were escalating to federal agencies, bringing in resources that would transform his quiet ranch into a research site and probably destroy any privacy or normalcy he'd hoped to maintain. By noon, more vehicles were arriving. Official-looking SUVs with government plates, unmarked vans that probably belonged to agencies Daniel couldn't identify, even a military truck that set up a perimeter around his barn. People in suits and uniforms moved with purpose, establishing command posts and communication networks, and Daniel found himself being politely but firmly moved away from his own property to a temporary shelter they'd erected in his front yard. Sasha stayed with him, pressed against his leg, and Daniel wrapped an arm around her while watching his barn become a classified installation right before his eyes. The other Daniel had been similarly relocated on his side, visible through the portal as Daniel caught glimpses during the moments when researchers adjusted their positions. They'd both been pushed to the edges of their own discovery, reduced to witnesses, while others took control and made decisions that would affect their lives without consultation. A woman in a dark suit approached, carrying a tablet and wearing the kind of expression Daniel associated with people who'd been designated to handle difficult conversations. She introduced herself as Agent Sarah Park, Department of Homeland Security, and asked if Daniel would mind answering some questions. The mind was theoretical. Daniel understood he had no real choice in the matter. They talked for 90 minutes. Daniel providing his complete history, his military service records, his reason for buying this property, anything that might establish he wasn't a security threat or foreign asset, using a fictional portal story to cover some other agenda. Agent Park was professional and thorough, never threatening, but never giving Daniel reason to think he could refuse cooperation. When she finished, she said, "You're going to need to stay available for the next several days. We'll need continued access to your property, and you'll probably be asked to participate in briefings and assessments. Your cooperation is appreciated and will be noted in our reports." Do I have a choice? You always have choices, Mr. Reeves. But some choices have consequences that make them effectively unavailable. Which was a polite way of saying no, he didn't have a choice, not any real one. Daniel nodded, too tired to argue, and Agent Park left him with instructions to remain in the shelter area until cleared to return to his house. The day passed in waiting and watching while researchers and officials moved in and out of his barn. Occasionally, someone would brief him on developments, usually in terms so vague they communicated nothing meaningful. The portal remained stable but expanding. They were working on containment protocols. Federal agencies were coordinating response plans. Everything was under control, which Daniel recognized as the statement people made when things were very much not under control, but admitting it would cause panic. Evening came, and Daniel was finally cleared to return to his house for food and rest, though agents would remain on his property overnight to monitor the situation. He made dinner without appetite, Sasha's presence the only thing that felt normal in a day that had tilted completely sideways. He tried to sleep, but managed only a few hours before anxiety pulled him back to wakefulness. The second day brought more officials and more equipment. The barn was being transformed into what looked like a permanent installation, with climate control and power generators and security systems that would probably remain in place long after Daniel wanted them gone. He caught glimpses of the work through gaps in the perimeter they'd established, saw that they'd built a platform around the portal to allow easier access and measurement. Dr. Chen briefed him mid-afternoon, explaining that the portal appeared to connect not just two dimensions, but a network of parallel realities, all existing in the same physical location, but separated by quantum boundaries that the barn's unique structure allowed them to see through. The expansion was actually revealing more of these connections, turning the single gap into a window onto multiple alternate worlds. "How many worlds?" Daniel asked. "We've identified at least 7 stable connections so far, with evidence of more as the portal grows. Each appears to be a parallel version of this location, with varying degrees of divergence from your dimension. And they're all visible from here?" "Some are. Others seem to be visible only from adjacent dimensions. It's like looking through a series of windows, where some windows face each other and others face different directions. What about the people in those dimensions? Have you made contact?" "Limited. We've established communication protocols with researchers in 3 of the accessible dimensions. They're conducting similar analyses to ours, trying to understand what's happening and how to manage it." Daniel wanted to ask about the other Daniel, wanted to know if his counterpart was okay and being treated as well or poorly as Daniel himself was. But Dr. Chen's focus was on the physics and logistics of the portal, not the human elements, and Daniel sensed that personal questions would be redirected or dismissed. The expansion continued over the following days, the portal growing until it occupied nearly a quarter of the loft, a massive window onto multiple realities that attracted researchers and officials from agencies Daniel had never heard of. They built facilities around his barn, established protocols for studying and managing the portal, and generally turned his property into a site that would probably never return to normal ranching use. Through all of it, Daniel caught occasional glimpses of the other Daniel and other versions of himself from dimensions where the divergence had been more significant. Some looked almost identical, others showed differences in age or appearance or circumstance. One appeared to be a version of Daniel who'd never joined the military, another who'd been injured more severely than the shrapnel wound Daniel carried, a third who'd married young and had kids visible in the background when that version appeared at the portal. Each sighting reinforced how much of his life came down to choice and chance, how easily things could have gone differently at various decision points. The weight of that knowledge sat heavy in Daniel's chest. Not quite despair, but certainly a hollowing out of certainty about who he was and whether any version of himself was more legitimate or real than the others. Weeks passed, then months. The portal stabilized at roughly 10 times its original size, large enough that crossing through became possible with specialized equipment the research teams developed. They sent probes first, then volunteers wearing protective suits that shielded them from the transition zone's energy. The first successful crossing happened on a Tuesday in March. A researcher from one of the adjacent dimensions stepping through into Daniel's world and standing in his barn, living proof that the boundaries between realities were permeable if approached correctly. The implications were staggering. If people could cross between dimensions safely, if resources and information could be transferred, the potential for both benefit and catastrophe was enormous. Some dimensions might have solved problems that plagued others. Some might contain dangers or diseases or instabilities that could spread if brought across. Managing the risks while capturing the opportunities would require coordination across multiple realities, agreements between governments that didn't even exist in the same universe. Daniel's role in all this diminished over time. He was consulted occasionally, his knowledge of the barn's history useful for understanding the portal's origins, but mostly he was left alone to resume ranching while researchers worked in his barn and security personnel patrolled his land. His life had become strange by definition, but routine in practice, the impossible rendered mundane through daily exposure. Sasha aged through those months, her muzzle going whiter, her pace slowing. She'd been young when they'd served together, prime age for a working dog, but now she was entering her senior years and the work took more out of her. Daniel made accommodations, shorter patrols, more rest time, the kind of adjustments you made when your partner's body started to fail, even as their spirit remained strong. A year after the portal's discovery, Daniel stood in his barn, looking at what had been built around his discovery. The platform, the monitoring equipment, the security checkpoints, all the infrastructure of studying something that transcended normal science. And there, visible through the expanded portal, multiple versions of his barn extending through dimensions, each slightly different, each containing their own Daniels and Sashas and lives that paralleled his own. He thought about the moment he'd first seen himself through that gap, the shock and confusion and wonder of confronting proof that his reality was one among infinite alternatives. That moment had changed everything, had transformed his life from simple ranching into something that touched the edge of humanity's understanding of existence itself. And yet, despite all the strangeness and complications, despite the federal presence and the lost privacy and the knowledge that his barn would never again be just his own, Daniel found he didn't regret the discovery. He'd been given a glimpse of something profound, something that most people would never see or understand, and that gift carried weight that transcended the costs. Dr. Chen found him in the barn one evening, standing near the portal as the sun set and painted the multiverse in shades of gold and amber. The physicist had become something like a friend over the months, or at least a familiar presence who occasionally shared insights about what they were learning. "You know, this portal is going to change everything," Dr. Chen said. "Not just science, but philosophy, religion, how we understand our place in existence. You found the door that opens onto infinity, Daniel. That's not small." "I just fixed a frozen pipe," Daniel replied. "The rest kind of happened to me." "Maybe, but you could have walked away. You could have sealed the loft and pretended you never saw anything. Instead, you investigated, you cooperated, you helped us understand what we were dealing with. That matters." Daniel nodded, watching the portal shimmer, watching the versions of himself visible through it. "What happens now? Where does this go?" "We're establishing formal contact protocols with the accessible dimensions, building frameworks for communication and cooperation. It'll take years, maybe decades, but eventually we might have something like an interdimensional community, sharing knowledge, resources, maybe even culture. It's early yet, but the possibilities are extraordinary. And the dangers? Those are extraordinary too, but we're aware of them, working on safeguards. It's a risk-benefit calculation that humanity's been making since we learned to use fire. Sometimes we get burned, but often enough we find that the warmth was worth the danger." Dr. Chen left, and Daniel remained. Sasha pressed against his leg as they watched the multiverse together. If you've followed this story through its turns and complications, maybe you understand what Daniel learned standing in that barn. That the boundaries we think are solid often turn out to be permeable, that reality contains more than any single perspective can encompass, and that being part of something larger than yourself, even when it's frightening and overwhelming, can be its own kind of grace. The stars came out overhead, visible through the barn's windows, and Daniel wondered how many of those stars existed in multiple dimensions, burning in parallel realities, watched by multiple versions of every person who'd ever looked up at the night sky. The thought was dizzying, but also comforting. If infinite versions of himself existed across infinite worlds, then no single failure or success defined him. He was all of it and none of it. Every choice and consequence playing out across dimensional boundaries he'd never fully understand. Sasha whined softly, her signal that she was ready to go inside, and Daniel obliged, leaving the barn and its impossible portal for the house and whatever normal evening routines remained possible. The next day would bring more researchers, more questions, more incremental progress toward understanding what they'd found. But tonight was his, and he'd spend it the way he spent most evenings, with his dog and his quiet thoughts, and the knowledge that the universe was vaster and stranger than anyone had dared imagine. And if that knowledge sometimes felt like burden, it more often felt like gift, proof that life could surprise you even when you thought you'd seen everything. Daniel Reeves had been a Marine, a rancher, a man trying to build a quiet life far from the chaos of his service years. Now he was also the person who'd found the door between worlds, who'd stood at the threshold of infinity and chosen to step forward rather than away. That identity would follow him the rest of his life, mark him in ways both visible and subtle, and he'd accepted it because the alternative was pretending he'd never seen what he'd seen, never touched the impossible, and found it real. The years rolled forward, and the portal remained, and Daniel continued his work, tending cattle and land, while researchers tended mysteries that transcended any single dimension. Sasha passed eventually, her old body finally surrendering after a long life well lived, and Daniel buried her on the hill overlooking the barn where they'd made their discovery together. He planted flowers on her grave that bloomed every spring, a reminder that some bonds transcended even the distances between worlds. New versions of himself continued to appear through the portal as it expanded to reveal more dimensions, and Daniel made peace with the multiplicity of his own existence. He was not one man but many, each living their own lives, making their own choices, achieving their own versions of success or failure. And knowing that, accepting it, freed him from the pressure of believing any single outcome defined his worth. He grew old on the ranch, his body slowing, but his mind staying sharp, and the portal became such a fixture of his life that he barely noticed it anymore. Researchers came and went, protocols were established and refined, and slowly the multiverse opened to human exploration and understanding. Daniel's contribution to that opening was acknowledged in papers and histories, his name attached to the phenomenon in ways that would probably outlive him. But what mattered most to him wasn't the recognition or the legacy. It was the simple fact that he'd been present for something extraordinary, had witnessed the impossible made manifest, had touched the edge of infinity and come back changed, but intact. And when his own time came, years later, lying in the hospital bed in Twin Falls with family around him and the winter sun streaming through windows, Daniel's last conscious thought was about the portal, about all the versions of himself existing across all the dimensions, and whether they'd be dying too, in their own worlds, their own timelines, their lives ending in whatever variations their circumstances had created. The thought should have been frightening, contemplating his own multiplied mortality, but instead it was oddly comforting. He was not alone in death any more than he'd been alone in life. Every version of himself faced the same transition, the same step into whatever came after, and they'd face it together even if they never met, bound by identity that transcended dimensional boundaries. His last sight was the winter sunlight, gold and beautiful, and Daniel Reeves passed from his dimension, carrying with him the knowledge that reality was infinite, that he'd been privileged to glimpse that infinity, and that privilege alone had been worth every complication that followed. The portal continued without him, connecting worlds that would remember his name as the man who'd found the frozen pipe, fixed it, and in doing so opened a door that would never fully close. And maybe somewhere, in some dimension, a version of Daniel continued living, having made different choices or been granted different luck. And that version would carry forward the life this Daniel was releasing. But probably not. Probably all the Daniels were dying now, their shared biology calling time, regardless of dimensional variation. And that was okay. That was how things worked, how cycles completed, how space was made for whatever came next. If anyone found meaning in this story, if anyone recognized in it echoes of their own wondering about roads not taken and alternatives never explored, maybe they'd share it with someone else who needed to know that the boundaries between possible lives are thinner than they appear, and that every choice creates worlds we'll never see, but that exist nonetheless, real and valid and worthy of whatever grace the universe extends to all its varied possibilities. The winter sun set over Idaho, painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of amber and rose, and the portal in Daniel Reeves' barn continued its silent watch over the multiverse, a monument to the strange accident that revealed what had always been true, that reality is larger than any map can show, that identity is more fluid than any definition can capture, and that sometimes fixing a frozen pipe leads to infinity if you're brave enough to follow where the mystery leads.